Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, actually, to all of you joining us today, wherever you are dialing in from. On behalf of the Green Finance Institute, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, I would like to welcome you to this workshop, tailored for country practitioners and focused on capital recruitment. I'm Kareem Arslan from the Green Finance Institute, one of the organizers of the summit and the co-program director of the Green Bank Design Platform. So before we dive in, I would like to walk you through the agenda for today and some of the rules for the session. Daisy, if you can move to the next slide, please, where we have the agenda. So today, to start, we'll have a bit of introduction. Kindly, Jeremy Gorlick, our Senior Strategy Advisor at the Green Finance Institute, will kick us off by giving a brief introduction and framing of the session. And then he will kindly be moderating the panel discussion with our esteemed guest speakers. The panel discussion will last for about 30 minutes, and then will be followed by smaller group breakout rooms. The goals of the breakout rooms are to have an interactive discussion with peers and ask questions, learn, and problem solve. Daisy will be our tech guru for today, and she will be managing the splits into the 3 different breakout rooms. Thank you, Daisy. And if you have any problems or issues, feel free to message Daisy on the chat. Now, some ground rules for the session. Daisy, if we can move to the next slide, please. Please ensure that the microphone is muted if you're not speaking. Keep your video on if you can to ensure maximum engagement. For the panel discussion, if you have any questions for our panelists during the discussion, please feel free to type your message or a question in the chat box or direct message me on Zoom, and we'll ensure that these questions are picked up and covered if time permits. And before I hand over to Jeremy, I thought it's a good idea just to do a check-in question with everyone for 30 seconds. In the chat box, if you can, because I know we're all joined from all over the globe and different time zones. If you can let us know where you're connecting from and what were you doing just before you joined the session. I'll give us 30 seconds to add this in the chat box. And Jeremy, I'll hand over to you, and if you can pick it up in 30 seconds to kind of go through the intro and the framing. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed this workshop.
I'm not seeing anybody putting anything in the chat box yet. I'd love to know where everybody's dialing in from. I think that's a great question, Kareem, to start off with. Okay, well,
as expected, so many geographies from Jeremy.
Yes, and while everybody is doing their answers, I am pleased to just run through a little bit of a framing for today's session, and I'm also glad to see that the numbers keep on climbing up as we are killing some time waiting for the rest of the crew to show up for this very important and interesting session. So I'm sure that many of you have dialed in for the plenary and some of the earlier presentations during the course of this week. And so many of you are feeling inspired about the fact that you too can create a green bank, that this is an opportunity for you to be able to accelerate the flow of capital to green projects in your respective countries. But the question isn't really why do you want to do it? The question is how do you do it? And we can talk about the 2 main areas as far as what is the right way to deploy money and see that there's a pipeline of projects. But before you can really think about deployment, you need to think about how are you sourcing the capital that's required to be able to deliver and capitalize this structure. And so the 3 panelists we have today will be able to talk through that in a greater amount of detail than I think anybody's even expecting. And I hope that during both the panel session and then during our breakouts, we'll be able to get a bit deeper into this. But just to help to frame this out, let's make sure we don't forget that green banks can be capitalized in a number of different ways, and that this is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. At the same time, for many of the green banks around the world, whether we're talking in a developing country context or in a developed country context, initial capitalization is often from public sources and usually domestic ones. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's exclusively from domestic sources. And particularly in the emerging markets context, we can see that there's partial capitalization coming from sources such as DFIs, climate funds, bilateral donors, or other sources. The thing that we all need to keep in mind and make sure not to forget is that the source of the funds that we use to capitalize green banks can be critically important, because each funder will have its own things that they're looking at as far as development impact metrics or other important things that you need to make sure that you're delivering on. And so one of the things that I'm really hoping that we'll be able to get into over the course of this session today will be looking at the different facets of capital recruitment, but also the motivations for some of those different sources of capital. So with that, and because I think everybody's not dialing to hear me, but instead to hear the panelists, I'm going to move through each of the three panelists that are on the screen, just to introduce them to you, and I'm sure that you'll all click on their LinkedIn profiles to get more detail on each of their respective backgrounds and sets of experiences. So Craig Weiss is the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Green Investment Finance Group. Nomandari Enkter is the CEO of the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association and Portfolio Manager at the UN Joint SDG Fund. And Tom Bishop is the Climate Finance Officer within the private sector facility of GCF. The reason why we have this set out the way that we do as far as an order of speakers is because we first want to hear Craig talk about his perspective as the Chief Executive in New Zealand, looking at the concept of how do we see funds flowing both in and out of this type of an organization that has a track record to speak of, and what does that look like as a more established entity. Moving on from there, and again, since many of you are in the process of trying to start up or at least consider how to start up your own green finance institution, Nomandari can talk through her process as far as what she went through, and then we'll end up with Tom, who'll be able to talk about it from the perspective of a capital source. How do you mobilize that money? How do we make sure that the mobilization is correct and effective? And so each of these speakers will have 6 to 8 minutes to be able to share their thoughts and experiences, after which we'll go into breakout rooms that Daisy will help us to get slotted into. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Craig and ask him to share some of his thoughts. Again, as he's going through some of his conversational points, please feel free to put questions in the chat. Both Kareem and I will be monitoring the chat, and we'll be posing questions as part of that discussion after the three panelists all wrap up. Thank you very much. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Kia ora and welcome all. It's my pleasure to be here. A special shout out to one of my directors, Kevin Holmes, who's just chatted through saying he's online as well. So I'll have to choose my words very carefully in particular today. Hello, Kevin. Look, NZGIF, I'll say it now to get it out there because New Zealand Green Investment Finance is a bit of a mouthful, was actually the policy initiative of a government coming in. And so in considering the Green Bank model, it was decided some time ago that it was a good one, and the government, when it was formed, wanted to adopt. And so that put out a process that the government undertook with Treasury here to consider design issues, if you will. And I'll talk about those in a minute, but I'll give you a few things about our overall mandate to help you understand context first. One, there was a lot of consideration at the beginning about what a mission or purpose should be for us, and it was considered that it was acceleration of investment. I say that because acceleration is slightly different from being purely additional and has this timing element to it. As we all know, climate action requires speed of action, and so it was very purposefully chosen that acceleration should be an issue and should be front and foremost for us, so to get rid of that sometimes confusing dialogue that can occur in the market around when something additional and how that manifests. So that was a choice for us, And our mission is very much designed around that. And we have 4 objectives that support that. So all of our investments, firstly, have to contribute to lower GHG outcomes. Second, they all have to be commercial. Thirdly, they all have to have a co-investment aspect, because we're trying to drive private capital flows into the market. And finally, we have a market leadership and demonstration objective that we try to meet as well. In our mandate design, one of the things about those 4 objectives is that they were specifically unweighted. And they were unweighted because we recognized that we needed to try and facilitate investment over a long period of time in New Zealand, and that those things could manifest and be different, be important differently at different times. And so the approach that we took was, in thinking about how this would play out, was one that was very much aligned to net zero 2050 for us. So this was part of the overall climate dialogue in New Zealand. And we thought about 3 things. And so our mandate has been very much shaped by those 3 things. The first was kind of what institutional arrangements were available to us at the time. So New Zealand already had a fairly evolved set of structures available for, if you will, independence and commercial ownership of assets, even though they are publicly funded. So that's what we call in New Zealand a Schedule 4A company. It's a type of structure. And that allowed us very quickly to choose something that was well understood. We didn't have to recreate, if you will, an institution. Those arrangements were known in the market and known by our stakeholders and shareholders to what those meant, and came with some very added and important aspects around independence of decision-making and capitalization, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second thing we thought about was, what was our GHG emissions profile? And from a New Zealand perspective, how unique was it, and what did that mean, and how was that different from what was going on elsewhere in the world? So we're very conscious that because we have a high renewable generation due to a lot of hydro assets in the country, that many of the things we would need to look at faster than others also have other attributes. So as you all know, in many places, large scale renewable energy production is a big focus for green banks. For us, we had to look elsewhere in the economy because our emissions track towards, say, agriculture, for example, and transport. And so that was a big design feature. And those are deals that have different capital structures and different capital requirements, which is why I note that. And then finally, I think we had to think very much about our local market. So how mature is our local market? Where was their capability? What's kind of deal size? And one of the things that we're conscious of is that although New Zealand is a fairly developed country in terms of financial markets, we're also a very small country, and small financial markets have different issues than big ones. There are gaps in them. There are other barriers that are not just about, say, green investment. So we took all these things and shaped our mandate accordingly. And we were given, of course, this gift, if you will, from the government, which was they wanted an institution, but they wanted one that was going to work. However, they were only willing to give a certain amount of capital to us in the first instance. So that was $100 million of investment capital. We very, very much knew that that was not going to be enough over time, but we also knew that we would have to earn the rest of it, if you will. So it was very important for us coming to that acceleration point to get started and get going with that capital. But we always had from day one in mind that we would, be both getting a track record and building it and showing that we could be good stewards of that capital, as with any manager. And that would allow us to ask and get more. Fortunately, we recently were successful in that objective and probably met it a little bit sooner than we even thought otherwise, because of the increasing, I guess, focus on growing climate investment in New Zealand. So that was helpful for us. We made a really important distinction in those early days around what that capital looked like from an investment versus operating perspective. So we wanted to make sure that we could retain as much independence as possible And part of that was talking about the concept, which we were successful in getting, of having the subscription for shares that were our operating capital will be separate to our investment capital. So we essentially took the amount of money that we thought it would take for us to become a sustainable institution and put that in a separate share structure, so that the dialogue that we could have with our shareholder was, once you invest in us in this way, we will be able to generate revenues, including investment returns from other sources, so that we can be sustainable. And at that point, we will start to actually pay you back that operating capital. So we think that was a very strong and important part of the negotiation, because of the not just the independence that it gives, but also the, from a policy perspective, the strength of being able to say, hey, if you fund us now, this policy can essentially pay for itself, right? And that's a very powerful thing when you think about it, and you're getting government capital in particular. So we took all those things together, designed a mandate that we thought could work on that basis, and gave it a couple of really big attributes. So we wanted it to be enduring, because we had to go across 30 years and across many sectors, and we needed to be able to use that strength and the flexibility to meet the objectives as we decided. And we want it to be useful across the capital structure, no matter where our money was needed. So the needs in agriculture, for example, are quite different than the needs in transport. And so flexibility was really key for us. And that flowed not just from our institutional mandate in terms of what we look like, but it then flowed into our investment mandate as well, which once again is very flexible. So we can invest in debt, equity, we can credit enhance, we can do all those things, because that's what the market requires in New Zealand. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there and look forward to talking about those issues in greater detail for any of you who join in the breakout session.
Thanks, Craig. Your comments were inspiring, and in particular, I found it interesting to imagine what the context was when you got this started up, and your journey to be able to accelerate, to be able to see more money coming in. So I'm looking forward to digging a bit deeper in on that. I haven't seen any specific questions come through for Craig, but again, I'm hoping that we can have a discussion amongst all three of the panelists when we get to the end of each of their respective presentations. So Craig, thank you very much. Really appreciate you making the time to join us. So again, happy to turn now over to Nomandari for her to share the journey in Mongolia, which is definitely at a different place as far as its evolution relative to New Zealand. And so I think it'll be great to have that juxtaposition of New Zealand and Craig's experience against Nomandari's experience in Mongolia. Nomandari, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. And for us, it's also a pleasure to be here today. And in addition to myself, I also have my colleagues, Mr. Bolt, who's currently the CEO of the Mongolia Green Finance Corporation, and also some colleagues from the Sustainable Finance Association. And since we have a relatively smaller group of people in the session, perhaps we can have an open discussion, more, freely speak about the different experiences. And ourselves, we are still learning from different countries, like people like Craig and the New Zealand Corporation and other green bank models. So I think it's a new area, still evolving, a lot of questions and of course challenges around this. So yeah, we are also looking forward to learning and listening to other people. So also to start with a little bit of background information. Daisy, can you share the slides? Yeah, perfect. So I do have a few slides here. Background information about the Mongolia Green Finance Corporation. It's also a very long name for our institution, so we name it MGFC for short. And this project itself stems from a local sustainable banking initiative that we have started back in 2013 by the banking sector. And as part of this initiative, we developed a set of sustainable finance principles, very similar to the Equator Principles or the UNPRI or the Principles for Responsible Banking, but adjusted to local context, which basically helped banks in the integration of environmental, social, and governance considerations in their investment activities. And this initiative itself was very successful, and in a sense that the whole sector came together to work on sustainable finance issues, and all of the banks in the country adopted these principles on a voluntary basis in 2015. However, along the road, we did realize that we're not doing well on the opportunity side of sustainable finance. And there was particularly a very large gap between all the green funding commitments and the new announcements that were happening at the global level to the Paris Agreement and to organizations such as GCF and other development finance institutions, and then the understanding and the technical capacity of local financial institutions to really be able to access those funds. And at that time, probably 2 of the larger banks did already have access to international climate funding, but for the rest of the mid or to smaller size of banks, this was a very difficult mission, despite their interest and very active commitment to work on sustainable and green finance. So recognizing this in 2016, basically we introduced during our annual Sustainable Finance Forum this concept of setting up a national dedicated institution that would promote green finance by addressing some of these challenges that we're facing, this inadequate access of local financial institutions to climate-related financial resources, lack of financial incentives to work on these type of products, and high cost of capital of local financial institutions as well. And as a solution to this, the government of Mongolia, local banks, basically led and represented by the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association, and international partners, including our colleagues from GCF and the Global Green Growth Institute, have started working collaboratively on the design and establishment of NGFC, basically a national green financial institution that would enable access to low-cost credit facilities that would in turn help the government of Mongolia meet its green development and climate commitments made under the Paris Agreement, which you can see here on the slide. And if we go to the next slide, please. And what is pretty much unique about MGFC and how it is different than many existing or emerging green banks is that it's based on a public-private partnership model. And on this slide here, you can see how this PPP model is also reflected in the organization's capitalization structure. And in its first phase, MGFC's capitalization is planned at $50 million with equal equity contribution from the government, local banks, and then also GCF channeled through a local accredited entity named Hasbank. And in addition to that, GCF will also be providing another 20 million in loan financing, 2 million in grants, and the government will also be channeling $30 million senior loans as co-financing. And the capital disbursement model of MGFC is a wholesale funding structure, so following a two-step loan approach, basically to minimize costs and also leverage on the existing capacity and branch networks of local banks. So MGFC will not directly finance individual projects in its early years of operations, but mainly rely on participating financial institutions that meet MGFC's due diligence requirements. And these local financial institutions will on-lend to those, those funds to projects and end users that would promote basically energy efficiency in industries, green affordable housing development, and also air pollution reduction and cleaner heating solutions that are more micro green finance products, very also critical to the country. And similar to the New Zealand one, we do also have a co-investment requirement. So another leverage point for MGFC is that for all participating financial institutions, they have to match at least MGFC's funding with a 20 to 30% co-funding from their own financing resources. So in all the different levels or pillars of the disbursement model, we made sure there was a co-investment element. And the next slide, you can see just another table that describes the capitalization structure of this institution. And it's been already 4 years, I think 5 years since we started with the MGFC project. And GCF's financial commitment was approved during the November board meeting last year. And right now we're working with the government and banks to finalize the shareholder agreements and the investment commitments that should come from the local resources. And the next slide. Of course, this institution is going to create a lot of benefits in terms of GHG emission reduction, energy efficiency, and also green job creation. But it also brings a lot of direct benefits, which you can see in the next slide, and also goals which also partially led to the design and the choice of our current PPP-based capitalization model. So you can see those key elements in the next slide, please. So we first envisioned that this organization will have a policy mandate to act as a key focal point, or you can say as a government financing arm, to invest in projects that are in line with the country's climate agenda. So by investing into NGFC, the government plays a key role in setting the policy objectives of this institution and also helping us identify additional low-cost funding sources that are usually not available or accessible to purely commercial private financial institutions. And then secondly, MGFC is also fully committed to act professionally and independently in line with international governance standards and very far away from political influence and interest. And this objective is mainly being ensured by the participation of the private sector in the shareholding structure. And this was very critical for a developing country like Mongolia, as we had a lot of bad experiences in the past where similar funds or institutions never operated successfully or sustainably because of bad governance principles or political interference in the operation. So this is also one of the reasons why all the partners agreed that we would not set up MGFC as part of an existing public financial institution. And third, of course, we have GCF, and GCF's role is very important as a catalytic investor, really bridging public, private, and international climate funding and helping us build that initial and key foundation for this institution to create a good track record and use that to leverage and mobilize additional funding from various sources. And of course, last but not least, you can see that in our model, we have a strong participation of the local financial sector, and they play a very key market role because we want this institution to focus on filling the gaps in the financial system rather than competing with financial institutions' existing offerings and financial products. And our model, the products, if you look at our models, they're in the initial stage designed to be a bit more at the concessional side, but we're hoping these will also evolve into more commercial finance as green business and technologies become more competitive and mainstream. And these are, of course, the benefits of our capitalization model, but there are also downsides to it, as very rightly mentioned in the Green Bank report that was published by our RMI colleagues. And combining the several sources of capital really complicates the institutional design and the process due to the different requirements and processes to set up these institutions. And of course, we still have a lot of challenges to resolve and areas that we need to work on and where we seek support from partners and networks such as the Green Bank Design Platform. But this is the capitalization structure. The model that we have chosen is really based on the country's needs and the current situation. And so far, we are making progress. But as said, we are willing and happy to learn from other institutions, other examples as well. So I think I will stop here in the interest of time as well, and happy to answer any questions and listen to others' experiences in the breakout session.
Thanks, Nomandari. That was terrific, and I know that you have a much lengthier slide deck than what you even had time to share. We'll make sure that the audience in the room has an opportunity to see some of those additional points, because I think that you have some great things for them to keep in mind as far as what they can learn from the experience in Mongolia. And again, once Tom gives his presentation, I do want to take a few minutes for us to just dig a little bit deeper on comparative experiences. But again, it's important not just to talk about what's happened in some of these organizations as far as how they've started themselves up, but also what the appetite and expectations are from some of the capital sources that play that critical role of enabling these to get started in the first place. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Bishop, who is able to talk a little bit about what GCF's role has been in helping, for example, in Mongolia, but also in a number of the other institutions around the world that have been set up to be able to play this role in helping to catalyze green finance for climate smart infrastructure and other investment opportunities around the world. Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. And I'm happy to be here from GCF from the funder side. To start off, identifying the right source of funding for your Green Bank will depend a lot on what Green Bank model that you're going for. As you've seen, there's a few different models that you can choose from. Some are more geared towards the public side, as you saw with Craig. Some are PPP model, as you saw with MGFC, and some might be purely private sector. So depending on the model you choose, that will largely affect the funding source. But from the initial standpoint, you would need to have the right business plan for your green bank that can then direct you to what type of model that you would want to use. So questions like what market barriers are you trying to address? What types of projects do you want to finance? Are you looking to scale up already commercialized technologies? That might be more of a private sector approach. Or are you looking to invest in harder to finance technologies, forestry projects, climate smart agriculture? That generally would lend itself to more of a public sector approach and then more public sources of financing. From GCF's side, we've had a little bit of experience in both, and I'll talk about 3 specific models that we've had: national green investment funds, green banks, and then also greening the operations of an existing development bank. On the national investment fund side, we had a proposal from United Nations Environment Program that was getting REDD+ payments to Paraguay for reducing their deforestation. And the Paraguayan government was going to use those REDD+ payments to help capitalize its National Climate Change Fund. And then that fund was going to invest in forestry projects in local communities. In this case, those types of projects are more geared towards public investments. Some of the pros here, the government has full control over where they're investing. So you have an ability to target your investments in line with your government, your Paris Agreement targets, your nationally determined contributions, versus the private sector, which may lean more towards the profitability side in choosing their target sectors. Public green banks can be more concessional, and they can use that concessional finance to crowd in the private sector down at the project level, even if the private sector isn't a source of funding. And the government could be a steady source of finance if you have the right political support. But again, every few years you're having a changing government, so that presents some risks of whether your funding is going to dry up if a new government comes in and doesn't have the same support for your green bank or green investment fund. That I would say is one of the major risks that you have in more of the public sector approach, and then also not being able to attract private capital, a bigger pool of private capital from international sources. The other model that you heard, MGFC from Noman Dari, that's more of a PPP approach. So when you're creating a new institution, there are some difficulties, more upfront costs. You have to get the management team in. So in general, this takes a longer amount of time, could be a little more complex. You also have to consider regulatory issues. Do you want to set up a non-bank financial institution? Do you want to set up a regulated financial institution? Those are some questions you'd want to ask up front. But the payoff can be worth it because setting up this new institution, you create really a green center of excellence in the country. And in MGFC's case, you're wholesale lending to other banks in the financial sector in Mongolia. So you're really bringing up the private sector as a whole in the country. And then also when you're setting up a new bank, you also have an indefinite lifespan as opposed to a fund, which you have to recapitalize every so often. The third option I'll talk about is with Development Bank of Southern Africa, the Climate Finance Facility. And this was greening DBSA's operation. They had worked with the Coalition for Green Capital to help develop this green operating arm called the Climate Finance Facility, and then came to GCF with a funding proposal asking for debt financing and then some additional technical assistance to get this green arm up and running. Some advantages to this strategy would be less upfront costs. So if you have the right institution already in place that has the capacity and the back office operations, you can avoid some of those initial operating costs of setting up a new institution. Some of the main concerns would be if you can't identify the right institution. So if you have a development bank in your country that has a development mandate, they might also be financing brown projects, maybe non-renewable sources of energy that would make it more difficult for that bank to attract climate finance from an international DFI like Green Climate Fund. And then on the commercial side, if you're looking to green a commercial institution, you would have to, they also obviously have the profit motive in addition to the green mandate. So you have a little bit of a contrast there. So one of the key advantages to setting up a new green bank is you have that green mandate that trumps all development or profit in general. Those are a few models that we've financed. In terms of the types of support GCF offers, there's tons of funders out there. GCF is just one of them, but the funding that we have is through 3 windows: readiness, project preparation facility, and funding proposals. So through readiness, we provide countries with up to $1 million per year. And this is through their national focal points, usually a Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Finance that has been appointed to GCF. And they can submit a proposal for all types of green finance work, but we've had a few where they use it to design and scope green banks or national green investment funds. So doing the early stage groundwork. And then once you've gotten the structure and the target sector's business plan down, you could graduate to the project preparation facility, which is up to $1.5 million per year. And this can be more technical work on governance, pipeline development, and really putting all of the pieces in place that you need to set up this green bank. And then finally, when you're ready for capitalization and starting your operations, we have funding proposals. So this is where the real money gets distributed to the green banks. In Mongolia's case, MGFC was submitted by one of GCF's accredited entities, Hasbank. So any funding proposal submitted to GCF has to be through one of our accredited entities. And in the MGFC case, we provided equity as well as debt and subordinated debt. So very flexible on the types of instruments that GCF can provide. But different types of DFIs will have different mandates and different instruments that they can offer. So having the model in place and the business plan in place will help you really identify who to go after when you're looking for funding. I'll stop there, turn it back to Jeremy, and then we can have hopefully more targeted conversation in the workshops. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate what you've shared as well. I think this has been extremely helpful to ground this in reality. What all 3 of you have done have been really helpful, I think, for the audience because of the fact that we're not talking about high-level theoretical and abstract constructs, but instead getting very specific as far as in what Tom just shared, the 3 different models, but also hearing from New Zealand and from Mongolia, the ways that they themselves have been able to successfully source money to be able to deliver on their goals of seeing these institutions capitalized in the way that makes the most sense. So before we go into our breakout rooms, I do have a question that I'm going to pose to both Craig and Nomandari. Tom, don't feel left out. I'll have a question for you as well. One of the things that, just looking through the list of the participants who are in the room, I know that many of you are coming in from countries where there's an exploration or an appetite for imagining green banks. And so one of the things that I would like to ask of both Craig and Nomandari, from your perspective, what would be the most important piece of advice or information that you would share with somebody who's starting the journey that both of you have completed, so that they keep one message or one mantra in their mind? If you can spend maybe a minute just sharing what you think is the most important thing for somebody to keep in mind, that would be a great way to start this panel conversation. Thank you. Let's go to Nomandari first and then to Craig.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's a really great question. And of course, there are a couple of different factors that we need to consider. But at the end of the day, the successful implementation of all these initiatives, and especially when there are new ideas, comes down to people, right? And finding really the right partners in the country who would support and fully understand this agenda, I feel was very important. Of course, we are referring to many institutions and organizations when we speak about these projects, but behind those are usually champions who understand this context. So finding the right people, having a discussion with them, coming on the same page and understanding of, why we need this, what the drivers are, and how we want to do this. And especially in countries like Mongolia, where the government changes a lot, we are right now probably working with the 5th Minister of Environment on this project. It's really important that you have this core team that really, continues to work on this idea and concept. So that was very important to us. And as I think Craig also mentioned, and also Thomas mentioned, the second thing I would say is really to think about the pipeline, because at the end, I mean, you can source the funding and the capital. There are a lot of commitments and interests from different investors, but if you don't have the project, it's going to be really difficult even after the setup. And that's still something that we are actually struggling in Mongolia to find really, quality bankable pipelines. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So thinking about what type of projects at the end you would like to invest in, I think it's really critical from the beginning. And that's the first question that usually investors also ask. So actually, I also had a question to Craig and Thomas to ask, like, how other countries are doing this successfully, where particularly you don't have a good list of pipeline yet, but where the countries are working, partners are working together to create those pipelines, building the capacity in the sector, or bringing in a facility that works on it. Sharing, listening to those experiences would also be helpful. But yeah, that's just.
Thanks, Namadari. So champions, absolutely. I think that's a common theme that we hear throughout, and some of the speakers throughout the course of the rest of this week, both before and after, will get to the political will and the championship question. Project pipeline is something that we know plague a lot of the nascent green banks. So it's something that I'd love to be able to dig into on the panel. But before we get to that, Craig, could you share some of your thoughts on that question on what the audience and participants should keep in mind as they're starting or at various places on this journey of creating a green bank themselves?
Sure. And I mean, I'll underscore the importance of, I think, what Namadari said, and I'll put a different lens on it as well. So I think it's building credibility really quickly amongst your stakeholders. And that's not easy to do because you've got to balance a number of them. So you've got to, in my view, you have to balance, and this will be different in each country, but some sort of public sector stakeholder who wants it. So let's call that government. And you have to have credibility with them and understand what makes them tick and why they would do these things and support it. At the same time, you have to be very credible in markets, and your success ultimately will be based on your ability to source those deals and to do transactions in market that generate return. And so you need to get a good balance between the two. And if you're overly market focused and at first, that can hurt you in terms of what policy people are wanting to see as an outcome. And if you're overly, obviously, kind of government focused, you won't have the credibility you need in markets to be effective or as quickly. And so, it's an important balance to think about what you need and the people you need around you, coming back to Namadari's point, to have that credibility amongst those stakeholders. There are others as well, but I think those are the two primary in most jurisdictions. Because you need to bring that market understanding to government, and you need to help the market understand why government wants to do that and your role in the market.
Great, thanks, Craig. So I want to come back to the pipeline question, but before that, and again, I also want to make sure we have time, sufficient amount of time for our breakout sessions. But Tom, I do want to ask you a question as far as being a source of capital. One of the things that I find that a number of people ask is, so I'm approaching all these different sources of capital, trying to figure out how best to capitalize this structure. And we think that we know what good looks like, but one of the things that they often struggle with is, how do we make sure that we're not putting something that is the opposite of good, something that a source of capital will say, oh, these people are not serious, they haven't thought this through, or whatever else the case might be. Can you share examples, again, not naming the names of who they are, but can you share what you've seen as far as challenges when people have come and put an application in, the things that make you pause and question whether or not these are as serious an application for funding for green banks? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I'll highlight two important things for GCF and probably for a lot of these international DFIs. Impact measurement being a first thing. Obviously, when you're creating a new bank and you have a projected pipeline, you don't know exactly what the projects you're going to finance are up front. But unfortunately, in order to access these funds, you do need to have a good idea of what sectors and what types of projects you're going to be targeting, and a system in place for monitoring, reporting, and verifying those results. Sometimes we've seen projects that say, want the money before they actually develop much of the pipeline, or don't really have a good system for measuring the impacts and the results, and that's really work that a lot of DFIs like Green Climate Fund would require you to do up front in order to access those funds. Another big thing for GCF, especially private sector operations, is additionality. So why do you need concessional finance if that's what you're looking for, finance from one of these public sector DFIs? Why do you need the concessionality versus private sector finance? And that needs to show that there are market barriers that aren't being addressed. And how is this equity, debt, or whatever going to be blended with the local capital to bring it from non-bankable to bankable? And we harp on that a lot because there's a lot of projects that GCF could finance, but we want to hit that sweet spot for ones that are impactful and aren't being addressed by the market already.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I know I'm going to get killed by Kareem and company if I allow for this last question, but since this came from Nomandara, you can complain to her as well. I do want to hear, Craig, from your perspective, how did you create the pipeline at the very beginning? And let's try to keep it to 1 to 2 minutes, and then after that, Kareem, you'll be able to break us out into our breakout rooms.
Yeah, so what we did really early was like kind of deep sector work. And because we knew that the capital answer for us in terms of where money is needed in the market was going to be different in different sectors, we wanted to have that good understanding. And then, we've built what's very similar to any direct investment organization in terms of the investment team that originates, right? So yes, we're out there, speaking and doing the normal things, institution to institution that you do, but we're also out there really working the street, if you will, around how we originate. And that's more important in some areas than others because, one day we could do something that's kind of a venture capital type transaction because that's where we need investment here to give solutions, right? And then the next day we could be doing something that's a mezz piece and, or maybe even, project equity in something that you've seen coming for, 2 years. So it very much depends on the sector, but the model is about, people who already have some market connectivity and in some cases reputations in the market out there working really hard to originate. And that's in part because, as I said before, New Zealand is interested in those areas that kind of track our GHG emissions profile, which for us is not just about large scale renewables. And so that's why, it can be a slightly different answer for us.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Thanks, Nomandara. Thanks, Tom. I think that all three of your sets of comments only whetted everybody else's appetite for even more information. So you did your job very well in getting everybody in the room excited. Kareem, I'm going to hand it over for you to walk us through how we do our breakouts. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Craig, Nomandara, and Tom. Now I think we'll move to breakout rooms. Initially, we had a 45-minute breakout room where we'll split you, but given kind of the number, I think we can mix and match. What we'll do, we'll have 3 breakout rooms. Daisy will automatically split us into the breakout rooms. In each breakout room, you'll have either Craig, Numundari, and Tom with a facilitator. Facilitators will be me, Emma, and Jeremy. And what we'll do, we're going to time them for 12 minutes so that we finish on time. And then Craig, Tom, and Numundari plus the facilitator will move from each breakout room so that you can get to speak with each one of them and ask questions and exchange thoughts and problems and ideas. I'll stop talking and I'll hand it over to Daisy. Hopefully everything works on the tech side to move us into breakout rooms.